Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai stood beside his Mitsubishi A6M0, watching the morning mist burn off the jungle airstrip. His flight suit was already soaked with sweat. 94 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. By noon, the cockpit would hit 115. He held a classified intelligence briefing, American aircraft specifications, performance data, threat assessments. His eyes settled on one entry, F4U Corsair. American carrier fighter. Speed, 417 miles per hour. Rate of climb, 3,120 feet per minute. Sakai smiled. "Look at this," he said to his wingman, showing him the document. "The Americans built a racing plane and called it a fighter." The wingman studied the numbers. "Fast. Too fast." Sakai tapped the paper. "They sacrificed everything for straight-line speed. Look at the wing loading. Look at the weight. 14,000 pounds fully loaded. Our zero is 6,000 pounds. So they can run away. That's all they can do." Sakai folded the briefing and tucked it into his jacket. "A fighter that can't turn is no fighter at all. It's a target." The logic was sound, perfect even. Japan's A6M0 could turn inside any aircraft in the Pacific. It could outmaneuver, outclimb, and outfight anything with wings. Its dogfighting record was 12-1 in Japan's favor. Sakai himself had 37 confirmed victories. And now the Americans were sending up a fighter that weighed twice as much as a Zero, with a massive engine and stubby wings. A brute force design that contradicted everything the Imperial Japanese Navy knew about air combat. "They're desperate," Sakai said, "building whatever they can, hoping something works." He climbed into his Zero. The engine coughed to life. Around the airstrip, 23 other fighters prepared for dawn patrol. They'd intercept the American bombers coming from Henderson Field. Shoot them down. Return for breakfast. Just like yesterday. Just like tomorrow. What Saburo Sakai didn't know, what Japanese naval intelligence had catastrophically failed to understand, was that 340 miles southeast, on a muddy airstrip in the Solomon Islands, a completely different kind of fighter pilot was about to rewrite every rule of aerial combat. And his weapon wasn't a nimble dogfighter. It was a 2,000 horsepower monster that the Japanese would come to call Whistling Death. Rewind. October 1st, 1942. Naval Air Station, San Diego, California. First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh climbed out of the F4U Corsairs cockpit, drenched in hydraulic fluid. "Thing tried to kill me," he said to the ground crew chief. "What happened?" "Hydraulic line burst on final approach. Lost pressure. Landing gear wouldn't lock. Had to manually crank it down." Walsh wiped oil from his goggles. "Also, the stall characteristics are vicious. Drops the left wing without warning. And the oil cooler placement means I'm flying blind on takeoff until I get the tail up." The chief made notes. "Anything else?" "The cockpit's so far back I can barely see over the nose. Forward visibility is awful. The bounce on landing nearly knocked my teeth out. And something's wrong with the fuel system. I'm getting vapor lock at altitude." The chief stopped writing. "Sir, respectfully, is there anything you like about this aircraft?" Walsh thought about it. "Yeah," he said finally. "When you push the throttle forward, it goes like hell." The F4U Corsair was, by every conventional measure, a disaster. The U.S. Navy had ordered it in 1938, demanding the fastest, most powerful fighter they could build. Chance Vought delivered. The Corsair packed an 18-cylinder Pratt Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, producing 2,000 horsepower, more than twice the Zero's output. To handle that power, they needed a massive propeller, 13 feet 4 inches in diameter. But aircraft carriers have limited height, so Vought bent the wings into an inverted gull shape, giving ground clearance while keeping the landing gear short. The result looked like it had been designed by 3 different companies who never talked to each other. And it flew even worse than it looked. The Navy rejected it for carrier operations in 1942. Too dangerous. Pilots couldn't see the deck on approach. The landing gear bounced. The stall characteristics killed inexperienced pilots. The aircraft was simply too hot, too difficult, too unforgiving for carrier duty. So they gave it to the Marines. February 12, 1943. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Marine Fighter Squadron 124, VMF 124, received the first combat-ready F4U Corsairs in the Pacific Theater. The pilots stood in the jungle heat, staring at their new aircraft. Major Greg Boyington broke the silence. "What the hell is that?" The Corsairs sat on the muddy airstrip like angry blue sharks. The inverted gull wings, the massive cowling, the tail sitting high off the ground. "That," said their commanding officer, "is your new fighter." "Looks like someone crashed 3 different airplanes together," Boyington said. He wasn't wrong. The Corsairs' aesthetics were aggressive. The long nose, the bent wings, the huge propeller. Nothing about it suggested elegance or grace. But when the mechanics fired up the first engine, the sound made everyone stop talking. The R-2800 roared to life with a deep, hammering thunder that you felt in your chest. 2,000 horsepower, shaking the jungle. The propeller carved the air with a distinctive whistling sound, air flowing over the wing roots at high speed. "Okay," Boyington said. "That's impressive." Walsh, who'd been training on Corsairs in California, walked up to the aircraft and ran his hand along the wing. "You need to understand something about this fighter. It's not a Zero. It's not a dogfighter. If you try to turn with a Zero, you'll die." "Then what is it?" "It's a boom and zoom fighter." Walsh pointed at the engine. "You use that power and that speed to control the engagement. You dive down from altitude, make one pass at high speed, then climb back up before they can react. You never turn. You never slow down. You use energy." One of the younger pilots raised his hand. "What if they force us into a turning fight?" "Then you extend out, build speed, and come back on your terms." Walsh's voice was flat, certain. "This fighter doesn't fight by their rules. It makes them fight by ours." The concept was revolutionary. Every fighter pilot in the Pacific had been trained in dogfighting, turning, maneuvering, close-range combat. Walsh was describing something completely different. A fighter that refused to fight on the enemy's terms. "They're faster than us on the deck," one pilot said. "Zero's top speed is 330 miles per hour. And ours is 417. Walsh smiled. "They can't catch us. And once we're above them, they can't escape us. We control when the fight happens, how it happens, and when it ends." "What about their maneuverability?" "Irrelevant if they never get the chance to use it." The transformation wasn't immediate. The first Corsair combat mission launched on February 14, 1943. 4 aircraft, bomber escort duty. They encountered Zeros over Bougainville. Lieutenant Roger Haberman made the rookie mistake. He tried to dogfight, turned hard to engage a Zero. The Corsair's superior weight and wing loading meant he bled energy in the turn. The Zero got on his tail. Haberman did the only thing he could do. He pushed the throttle to maximum power and dove. The Corsair accelerated like nothing in the Pacific theater. 350 miles per hour, 380 miles per hour, 420 miles per hour. The Zero, already at its maximum speed, fell behind rapidly. Haberman pulled up into a climbing turn. The R2800 engine, with its two-stage supercharger, maintained power all the way up to 20,000 feet. The Zero, trying to follow, struggled above 15,000. Haberman leveled off at 18,000 feet. The Zero was still climbing, maybe 4,000 feet below. He rolled inverted and dove. The Corsairs' 6.50 caliber machine guns, 3 per wing, carried 400 rounds per gun, 2,400 rounds total. Firing rate, 800 rounds per minute per gun. Haberman opened fire at 600 yards. The Zero evaporated. Not shot down. Evaporated. The combined firepower of 6.50 cals at high closing speed simply tore the lightweight fighter apart. Haberman climbed back to altitude, his hands shaking. "Holy hell!" he said over the radio. "Did you see that?" Walsh's voice crackled back. "That's what I've been trying to tell you. This isn't a fighter. It's a flying gun platform with a 2000 horsepower engine." But the Japanese didn't understand what was happening. To them, the first encounters with Corsairs looked like cowardice. American pilots diving away from combat, refusing to engage, running. Sakai, after his first encounter with a Corsair, wrote in his report, "Enemy pilot demonstrated superior speed but avoided combat maneuvers. Suspect insufficient training or mechanical issues preventing sustained engagement." He'd seen the Corsair dive away at impossible speed, seen it climb back to altitude before his Zero could follow, seen it make a single high-speed pass and then disengage. His interpretation? American pilots were scared. The reality? American pilots were being smart. February 20th, 1943. Henderson Field briefing room. Major Boyington stood at a chalkboard covered in diagrams. "Forget everything you know about dogfighting," he said. "The Corsair doesn't dogfight. Here's how you fight in this aircraft." He drew altitude lines on the board. First, altitude is life. You always want to be above the enemy. Always. You use altitude like money in the bank. Second, speed is survival. You never slow down? Never. If you're slow, you're dead. Third, one pass, haul stern. You make one attack run, maximum speed, maximum surprise. Then you get out. You don't stick around to see what happened. You climb back up, assess, and either make another run or disengage. A pilot raised his hand. What if they're in a position where we can't dive on them? Then you don't engage. You wait. You let them burn fuel. You let them get frustrated. You force them to make mistakes. And when they're low, slow, or separated, that's when you strike. Another pilot. Sounds like we're avoiding fair fights. Boyington smiled. That's exactly what we're doing. Because fair fights are for suckers. We have the faster airplane. We have heavier firepower. We have better altitude performance. Why would we give up those advantages to fight on their terms? Silence in the room. The Japanese are the best dogfighters in the world, Boyington continued. In a Zero, they can outturn, outclimb, and outmaneuver almost anything. But they can't outrun us. They can't outdive us. And they can't survive a 6-gun burst from a Corsair at 400 miles per hour. He tapped the chalkboard. So we don't dogfight. We hunt. We're not fighter pilots anymore. We're predators. The numbers told a story the Japanese didn't want to believe. By March 1943, VMF 124 had flown 62 combat missions. Corsair losses, 4 aircraft. 0 losses to Corsairs, 38 aircraft. Kill ratio, 9.5 to 1. But the statistics didn't capture the psychological impact. March 8, 1943, 11:47 hours. Airspace over New Georgia Sound. Petty Officer First Class Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, one of Japan's top aces with 53 confirmed victories, led a formation of 12 Zeros on bomber escort duty. "Corsairs," his wingman called over the radio. "High, maybe 20,000 feet." Nishizawa looked up. 4 American fighters, tiny dots against the clouds, maybe 8,000 feet above them. "Maintain formation," Nishizawa said. "They won't engage at this altitude difference." He was wrong. Walsh, leading the Corsair flight, checked his altimeter. 22,000 feet. The Zeros were at 14,000. Perfect setup. "Remember," Walsh said over the radio, "diving attack, full throttle, hit and extend, no turning." He rolled, inverted, and dove. The Corsair accelerated instantly. The massive propeller bit into the thin air. The R-2800 howled. 300 miles per hour. 350 miles per hour. 400 miles per hour. The Zero formation grew in his gun sight. Nishizawa saw the diving Corsairs too late. He shouted a warning and broke hard left. Walsh ignored him. He'd already selected his target. A Zero in the center of the formation, flying straight and level. At 500 yards, Walsh opened fire. The 6.50 caliber machine guns converged on the Zero. The bullets, each weighing half an ounce, traveling at 2,850 feet per second, hit the lightweight fighter like a metal storm. The Zero's wing separated from the fuselage. The aircraft tumbled out of the sky. Walsh's closing speed was over 500 miles per hour. He flashed through the Zero formation in less than 2 seconds. By the time Nishizawa completed his evasive turn, Walsh was already 2,000 feet below them, pulling up into a climbing turn. Nishizawa tried to follow. His Zero, already at high altitude, struggled to build speed in the dive. Walsh's Corsair, with its massive power and weight, dove like a bullet. The gap widened. 1,000 feet. 2,000 feet. 3,000 feet. Walsh leveled off at 8,000 feet, checked his instruments, and began climbing back to altitude. His Corsair climbed at 3,120 feet per minute at combat power. Nishizawa's Zero managed about 2,200 feet per minute at that altitude. Walsh reached 20,000 feet. The Zeros were still at 16,000, climbing hard, burning fuel. "Set up for another pass," Walsh said to his flight. They dove again. Same tactics, same result. Another Zero destroyed. This time, Nishizawa didn't even try to engage. He called for his formation to head for home. That night, in his journal, he wrote, "Encountered new American fighter type. Impossible to engage using standard tactics. Recommend avoiding combat unless overwhelming numerical superiority." From one of Japan's top aces, recommending avoiding combat. But the hidden advantage wasn't just speed. The Corsair's real strength was energy management, the ability to convert altitude into speed, and speed back into altitude, more efficiently than any aircraft in the Pacific. Physics made it inevitable. The Corsair weighed 14,000 pounds. The Zero weighed 6,000 pounds. In a dive, gravity accelerates all objects equally, but the heavier object carries more kinetic energy. The Corsairs' weight, which seemed like a disadvantage in turning, became an overwhelming advantage in diving and climbing. Add the 2,000 horsepower engine, literally twice Zero's power, and the result was an aircraft that could control the vertical dimension of combat completely. Japanese pilots called it the yo-yo tactic. The Corsairs would dive, attack, climb back up, and dive again. The Zeros could never catch them in the dive, never keep up in the climb, and never escape during the attack. It was maddening, humiliating, and it only got worse. April 1st, 1943, VM F-124 introduced a new tactic, the Thatch Weave. Developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, the weave was a defensive formation where two fighters worked in tandem, each covering the other's tail. But in the Corsair, the Thatch Weave became an offensive weapon. Here's how it worked. Two Corsairs would fly parallel, separated by about 1,500 feet. When Zeros attacked, the targeted Corsair would turn toward his wingman. The wingman would turn toward him. They'd cross paths, weaving, and the wingman would end up behind the pursuing Zero. The Zero pilot would face a choice: continue pursuing the first Corsair and get shot by the second, or break off. Either way, the Corsairs maintained speed and position. Traditional dogfighting? The Zero would win. But the Thatch Weave with Corsairs meant the Americans never had to dogfight. They maintained speed, supported each other, and used their superior firepower to devastating effect. April 7th, 1943, 15:23 hours. Over Rendova Island. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh and his wingman Lieutenant Reinberg encountered 9 Zeros at 18,000 feet. 9-2. Terrible odds. Walsh didn't disengage. He initiated the Thatch Weave. The Zeros, seeing only 2 Corsairs, attacked aggressively. 4 Zeros dove on Walsh. 3 went after Reinberg. Walsh turned toward Reinberg. Reinberg turned toward Walsh. They crossed with maybe 500 feet separation. The 4 Zeros following Walsh suddenly found Reinberg directly in front of them, head-on, 6 guns blazing. The lead Zero exploded. The pilot never even tried to evade. He didn't expect the American to turn into the attack. Walsh continued his turn, building speed. The remaining 3 Zeros, confused, tried to follow. They couldn't match the Corsairs' turn radius at high speed. The F4U, despite its weight, had excellent high-speed handling. The Zero, optimized for low-speed turning, became sluggish above 300 miles per hour. Walsh completed his turn and found himself behind the Zero formation. He opened fire. A 3-second burst. Another Zero disintegrated. Meanwhile, Reinberg had used his head-on pass to scatter the 3 Zeros pursuing him. He climbed, using the R-2800's power to gain 4,000 feet in altitude before the Zeros could react. The remaining 7 Zeros now faced a tactical nightmare. 2 Corsairs with altitude advantage, speed advantage, and perfect mutual support. The Japanese flight leader made the smart decision. He called for disengagement. The Zeros dove for the deck, trying to use terrain for cover. Walsh and Reinberg followed, carefully, never getting slow, never exposing themselves, making single passes, and then climbing back up. By the time the Zeros reached their base, they'd lost 4 aircraft. Walsh and Reinberg landed at Henderson Field without a single hit on either aircraft. The ground crew counted Walsh's remaining ammunition. He'd fired 347 rounds total. That was 3 Zeros destroyed with 347 rounds, about 115 rounds per elimination. The Zero carried about 450 rounds total for its 220 cannons. Most Zero pilots needed 150, 200 rounds per victory. The Corsair carried 2,400 rounds and could spray bullets like water. It wasn't fighting. It was execution. May 13, 1943. Rabaul Airfield, Japanese pilot briefing. Commander Nakajima stood before 47 Zero pilots. On the chalkboard behind him, Corsair Tactics Mandatory Doctrine. Effective immediately, he said, you will not engage F4U Corsairs unless you possess overwhelming numerical superiority and favorable altitude position. Silence. Uncomfortable silence. One pilot raised his hand. Sir, are you ordering us not to fight? I'm ordering you not to die uselessly. Nakajima tapped the board. The Corsair cannot dogfight with the Zero. This is true. But the Corsair pilots know this. They will not dogfight. They will dive, attack, and climb. They will use speed and altitude. So we stay high. They stay higher. They have better altitude performance. Nakajima pulled out a graph. At 20,000 feet, a Corsair can climb at 2,900 feet per minute. Our Zero manages 1,400. They climb faster. They dive faster. They run faster. What about our maneuverability? Useless if you cannot force them into a turning fight. And they won't. American pilots have strict orders to avoid sustained combat. He paused. They control the engagement. We respond. This is unacceptable, but inevitable. Another pilot. What are our options? Nakajima's answer was blunt. Avoid them. If you must engage, attack only when they're slow or separated. Never attack a Corsair with altitude advantage. Never chase a diving Corsair. Never assume you can escape by turning. They'll extend away, climb, and come back. That's everything we do. Yes, that's the problem. The room sat in stunned silence. They were being told that their tactics, the tactics that had dominated the Pacific for 2 years, were now obsolete. One aircraft had changed everything. June 16, 1943, 0947 hours, airspace over the Russell Islands. Saburo Sakai had heard the reports, read the tactical briefings, studied the intelligence assessments, but he didn't believe them. The Corsair was fast, certainly, but speed without maneuverability was suicide in air combat. The Americans were simply avoiding fights they couldn't win. Eventually, they'd make mistakes. Eventually, they'd be forced to turn, and when they did, the Zero would destroy them. That's what Sakai believed, what he needed to believe. He was leading 8 Zeros on a bomber interception mission when they encountered 6 Corsairs at 19,000 feet. There, his wingmen said, pointing up. Sakai looked. The Corsairs were in a loose formation, circling lazily. They'd clearly seen the Zeros, but they weren't diving to attack. "Choose, why aren't they engaging?" his wingman asked. "Because we have altitude parity," Sakai said. "They need altitude advantage to execute their diving attacks." He smiled. Today, they don't have it. He was half right. Walsh, leading the Corsair formation, watched the Zeros below. "They think we won't engage at equal altitude," he said over the radio. "Will we?" his wingman asked. "Watch." Walsh pushed his throttle forward and nosed over slightly. Not a dive, just a shallow descent at maximum cruise power. The R-2800 roared. The Corsair accelerated from 250 miles per hour to 380 miles per hour in about 15 seconds. The Zeros, cruising at 230 miles per hour, suddenly saw 6 Corsairs approaching head-on at 380 miles per hour. Closure rate over 600 miles per hour. Sakai barely had time to shout a warning before the Corsairs flashed through his formation, all 6 fighters firing. The Zero on Sakai's right wing disintegrated. Just gone. One moment it was there, the next moment it was pieces falling toward the ocean. The Corsairs didn't turn. They continued their shallow dive, speed building to 420 miles per hour and extended 4 miles away before beginning a gentle climbing turn. Sakai tried to follow. His Zero couldn't match the acceleration. By the time he'd built up speed, the Corsairs were already 3 miles ahead and climbing. "Break off," Sakai ordered. "Reform." His formation, now 7 aircraft, regrouped, but before they could establish defensive positions, the Corsairs had climbed back to 21,000 feet. Walsh checked his formation, everyone intact, ammunition expenditure minimal. "Second pass," he said. This time Sakai was ready. When the Corsairs dove, he split his formation, half going high, half going low, trying to sandwich the Americans. It didn't work. Walsh ignored the Zeros going high. They didn't have the speed to catch him. He focused on the low group, made a single firing pass, and then extended away before the high group could descend. Another Zero fell smoking toward the ocean. The high group, trying to dive on the Corsairs, found themselves in a high-speed chase they couldn't win. The Corsairs simply extended, building speed, until the Zeros gave up. Then Walsh climbed back to altitude and set up for another pass. For 20 minutes, the engagement continued. The Corsairs would dive, attack, extend, and climb. The Zeros would maneuver, try to intercept, fail, and reform. By the time both formations were low on fuel and had to disengage, Sakai had lost 4 aircraft. The Corsairs hadn't taken a single hit. That night, Sakai wrote a different kind of report. The F4U Corsair represents a fundamental shift in aerial combat methodology. American pilots no longer attempt to engage in traditional dogfighting. Instead, they employ energy tactics that exploit their aircraft's superior power, speed, and climb rate. Our tactical advantage in maneuverability is nullified because we cannot force them into turning engagements. Their tactical advantages in speed and power are maximized because they control when and how combat occurs. Recommendation: Zero pilots should avoid combat with F4U Corsairs unless specific tactical conditions are met. Numerical superiority of at least 4 to 1, superior altitude position of at least 5,000 feet, and favorable terrain for escape. Even under these conditions, engagement is not recommended. The report landed on Admiral Yamamoto's desk. He read it 3 times. Then he called for an emergency conference with his air staff. July 2nd, 1943. Imperial Japanese Navy Aviation Bureau, Rabaul. The conference room smelled of cigarette smoke and humidity. 14 senior officers sat around a table covered with intelligence reports, combat assessments, and statistical analyses. Admiral Ugaki spoke first. The Corsair problem has become critical. Our loss ratios in the Solomon Islands have shifted from favorable to catastrophic. He displayed a chart. January through March, before significant Corsair deployment, Zero loss ratio 7 to 1 in our favor. April through June, after Corsair deployment, 3 to 1 against us. Someone coughed. The numbers spoke volumes. "It's not just the Corsair," another officer said. "It's American tactics. They've developed a fighting methodology that negates our advantages." "Then we adapt," Ugaki said. "We develop new tactics, higher altitude operations, improved climb performance modifications for the Zero, better training for high-speed combat. With what resources? The question came from a logistics officer. We're producing 200 Zeros per month. The Americans are producing 400 Corsairs per month, and their pilot training program graduates 3 pilots for every one of ours. Silence. The math was unavoidable. Japan couldn't outproduce America, couldn't replace losses at the same rate, couldn't match the industrial capacity. And now, they couldn't even win individual engagements. There's another issue, Sakai said from the back of the room. Everyone turned. The psychological impact. Explain. Our pilots are the finest in the world. We know this, we've proven it. But when they encounter Corsairs and cannot engage, cannot force combat, cannot win, it affects morale. He paused. Yesterday, I overheard 2 new pilots discussing whether they should request transfer to other duties. They'd rather fly reconnaissance than face Corsairs. The room absorbed this. How do we counter it? Ugaki asked. Sakai's answer was simple and devastating. We can't, not with current aircraft and tactics. The Americans have developed a superior combat system. We can modify our techniques, improve our awareness, optimize our operations. But fundamentally, the Corsair is a better combat platform for the type of warfare now being conducted. No one spoke. The admission hung in the humid air. But the Americans weren't content to just win. August 15th, 1943. Henderson Field. Major Boyington, now commanding VMF 214, the Black Sheep Squadron, stood before 32 pilots. Current kill ratio 11-1, he said. That's good, but it's not good enough. The pilots stared. 11-1 was extraordinary. The Japanese are adapting, Boyington continued. They're avoiding us, developing new tactics. We need to adapt faster. Here's what we're implementing immediately. Sir, he pointed to a diagram. Formation changes. Instead of 4 aircraft divisions, we're going to 8 aircraft formations with staggered altitude. High, medium, and low elements. The high element finds targets. The medium element engages. The low element cuts off escape routes. That's complicated. That's overwhelming. Boyington smiled. The Japanese want to avoid us? Fine. We'll make sure they can't. We'll occupy every altitude band, cover every escape vector, force them into engagements they can't win. He continued. Second change, fuel management. We've been fighting at maximum power, maximum speed. Now we're going to extend our range, cruise to the target at economical power, then fight at full power, then cruise home. This extends our combat radius by 80 miles. Why? Because they think they're safe if they stay away from Henderson Field's range. We're going to prove them wrong. Third change, target priority. We're not just going after their fighters anymore. We're targeting their bombers, their transports, their reconnaissance aircraft. Everything. We want them afraid to fly anything within 300 miles of our bases. A pilot raised his hand. Sir, isn't that a bit aggressive? Boyington's smile widened. That's the point. The Japanese introduced us to aggressive air combat in 1941. They burned Pearl Harbor. They destroyed our aircraft on the ground. They taught us that air superiority means owning the sky completely. He paused. Now we're teaching them what happens when America owns the sky, and we're using their lessons better than they ever did. August 30th, 1943. 10:34 hours over Bougainville. Boyington led 24 Corsairs on a fighter sweep deep into Japanese-held territory. They weren't escorting bombers. They weren't defending anything. They were hunting. At 22,000 feet, they found 18 Zeros protecting a formation of 6 Betty bombers. The Japanese formation was perfect. Fighters high and low, bombers in the middle, defensive positioning that should make attacks costly. Boyington split his formation. 8 Corsairs stayed high, 8 went medium, 8 dove low. The high element engaged the high Zeros, forcing them into defensive maneuvers. The medium element, Boyington's group, dove on bombers at 450 miles per hour. The low element cut off the escape route, engaging any Zeros that tried to dive away. The Betty bombers never had a chance. Each one was hit by multiple Corsairs, the combined firepower of 6.50 caliber machine guns per fighter. 4 of 6 bombers were destroyed in the first pass. The surviving 2 tried to dive for the deck. The low element was waiting. They were destroyed before reaching 10,000 feet. The Zero fighters, trapped in defensive fights against Corsairs that wouldn't stay and dogfight, could only watch their bombers fall. Boyington reformed his squadron. They'd lost 0 aircraft, destroyed 6 bombers, and 4 Zeros. "Return to base," Boyington ordered. On the way back, they encountered a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, a lone Ki-46 flying at the 28,000 feet, thinking it was safe. Boyington climbed after it. The R-2800 supercharger kept delivering power. At 32,000 feet, higher than the Ki-46, Boyington rolled inverted and dove. The reconnaissance aircraft exploded. The message was clear: nowhere is safe, no altitude is unreachable, no formation is secure. The Americans owned the sky. September 16, 1943. Rabaul Airfield. The statistics were undeniable. From February through September 1943, in the Solomon Islands Theater. F4U. Corsairs flew 3,967 combat sorties, engaged in 697 aerial combats, destroyed 584 Japanese aircraft, lost 53 Corsairs to enemy action, kill ratio 11.02 to 1, but the raw numbers didn't capture the strategic impact. Japanese air operations in the Solomon Islands had effectively collapsed. Bomber missions required fighter escorts so large that they couldn't accomplish their objectives. Fighter sweeps encountered Corsairs at every altitude and had to retreat. Reconnaissance aircraft were being shot down routinely. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost air superiority. Not gradually, suddenly, definitively. And it wasn't coming back. October 12, 1943. Interview with captured Japanese pilot, Petty Officer Saburo Ishii. American intelligence officer, why didn't you engage the Corsairs? Ishii, because we would have died. But you had altitude advantage. Altitude advantage means nothing against Corsair. They climb faster. We cannot escape upward. What about your maneuverability? Ishii laughed bitterly. Maneuverability is useless when the enemy will not turn with you. They dive, shoot, climb. We cannot catch them when they dive, cannot follow when they climb, cannot escape when they attack. So what did you do? We avoided them. When we saw Corsairs, we turned away, headed for clouds or low altitude, hoped they would not follow. Did that work? Sometimes. Usually they followed. Usually we lost aircraft. He paused. I saw a Corsair catch a Zero in a dive. The Zero's maximum speed is 330 miles per hour. The Corsair was doing maybe 450. The Zero pilot tried everything. Turned, rolled, dove steeper. Nothing worked. The Corsair just stayed behind him, then fired. 3 seconds. The Zero exploded. "What did you think when you saw that?" Ishii's answer was quiet. "I thought, we have already lost this war." November 1943. The legend grows. VMF 214, Boyington's Black Sheep Squadron, achieved 94 confirmed victories in 84 days. VMF 215 achieved 137 confirmed victories. VMF 121 achieved 208 confirmed victories. The Corsair squadrons weren't just winning, they were dominating. And the Japanese pilots had a name for them: Whistling Death. The name came from the sound the Corsair made in a dive. The air flowing over the wing roots created a distinctive whistling shriek. Japanese soldiers on the ground could hear it seconds before the attack arrived. That sound became associated with defeat, with terror, with death from above that you couldn't escape. The technical evolution continued. By late 1943, Corsair pilots had refined their tactics to a science: the high-low split. Two elements at different altitudes, forcing Japanese formations to divide their attention. The rope-a-dope, appearing to flee, drawing Japanese fighters into extended chases that burned their fuel, then turning on them when they were vulnerable. The hammer and anvil. Itoturt's one element engaging from the front, forcing Japanese fighters to turn, while another element attacked from behind. Every tactic exploited the Corsairs' advantages: speed, climb rate, power, and firepower. And every tactic had been developed in combat, refined through trial and error, perfected through experience. December 17, 1943. Kenneth Walsh's 20th victory. Walsh spotted a lone Zero escorting a transport aircraft over New Georgia. He was at 24,000 feet. The Zero was at 16,000. Perfect setup. Walsh rolled inverted and dove. The airspeed indicator climbed past 450 miles per hour. The Corsairs' controls stiffened. High-speed compression affecting the control surfaces. Walsh compensated with pressure on the stick. The Zero pilot never saw him coming. Walsh opened fire at 400 yards, closed to 200 yards, kept firing. The Zero's wing folded. The transport tried to dive away. Walsh pulled out of his dive, climbed 1,000 feet in about 8 seconds, then dove on the transport. It was a slow, lumbering target. Walsh fired a 2-second burst. The transport's right engine exploded. It spiraled into the ocean. Total engagement time, 34 seconds. Walsh climbed back to altitude. His heart rate was barely elevated. This had become routine. But the cost wasn't just numerical. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was severe. Morale collapsed. Experienced pilots requested transfers. New pilots arrived at forward bases, already convinced they would die. A Japanese naval aviation officer wrote in his diary, "The Americans have changed the nature of air combat. Before the Corsair, we fought with skill and courage. Now they fight with physics and brutality. Skill cannot defeat physics. Courage cannot defeat brutality. We are losing pilots not because they are poorly trained, but because the American system is superior." The admission was crushing. Japan had built its air strategy around pilot quality, aircraft maneuverability, and aggressive tactics. The Corsair had made all of those advantages irrelevant. January 1944. The final evolution. Marine Corsair squadrons began experimenting with ground attack missions. The F4U could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs, or 8 5-inch rockets. On January 14th, VMF 214 conducted the first Corsair ground attack mission against Japanese positions on New Britain. The results were spectacular. The Corsairs dove from altitude, released bombs at high speed with impressive accuracy, then strafed ground targets with their 6.50 caliber machine guns before climbing back to altitude. Japanese anti-aircraft fire couldn't track them. The Corsairs were too fast, too high, and too powerful. Suddenly, the Corsair wasn't just an air superiority fighter, it was a multi-role combat aircraft. Fighter, bomber, ground attack, reconnaissance, one platform, multiple missions. February 1944, Saburo Sakai's final encounter with Corsairs. Sakai, now an instructor training new pilots, was flying a familiarization mission when his formation encountered 4 Corsairs near Truk. He'd trained these pilots personally, told them everything he knew about Corsair tactics, emphasized survival over heroics. It didn't matter. The Corsairs dove from 25,000 feet, made a single pass. 2 of Sakai's students were dead before they could react. Sakai tried to organize a defense. The Corsairs climbed back up, repositioned, and dove again. Another student died. Wheat, the 4th, a 19-year-old kid who'd graduated flight school 3 weeks earlier, panicked and tried to dogfight. Sakai watched the Corsair match the Zero's turn at 350 mph, a speed where the Corsair's heavier weight and more powerful controls actually gave it similar turn performance. Then the Corsair pilot simply pushed the throttle forward and extended away before the Zero could capitalize. The Zero, now slow and vulnerable, was easy prey for the Corsair's second pass. 4 students, 4 coffins. Sakai returned to base alone. That night, he requested transfer to administrative duties. He would not fly combat missions for the remainder of the war. By war's end, the F4U Corsairs record spoke for itself. 2,140 Japanese aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 64,051 combat sorties, 1 overall kill ratio. In Korea, 12.5. 1 kill ratio against North Korean and Chinese aircraft. It became the longest-serving piston engine fighter in U.S. history. The last squadron retired in 1965, 22 years after introduction. But the numbers don't tell the real story. The real story is this. The F4U Corsair proved that in modern combat, speed and energy management defeat maneuverability and tradition. The Japanese built the Zero around the philosophy of lightweight, maneuverable, supremely agile aircraft flown by highly trained pilots. That philosophy had worked brilliantly in China, in the Philippines, in the early Pacific campaigns. Then the Corsair arrived and made that philosophy obsolete overnight. Not because it was better at dogfighting, because it refused to dogfight at all. The Americans had learned the lesson Germany tried to teach Britain in 1940. You don't fight the enemy's battle. You force them to fight yours. Kenneth Walsh survived the war with 21 confirmed victories. He received the Medal of Honor. In 1990, interviewed at age 74, he reflected on the Corsair. People ask me if I was scared flying those missions. Honestly, not really, because I was flying a Corsair. That aircraft made you feel invincible. Not because it was the most maneuverable or the easiest to fly. It wasn't, but because you controlled the fight. You decided when to engage, how to engage, and when to leave. The enemy didn't get a vote. That's power, real power. Not having the best plane, but having the plane that lets you dictate terms. Saburo Sakai lived to age 84. He became a businessman, raised a family, and wrote several books about his experiences. In one interview, decades after the war, he was asked about the Corsair. "It was not the best aircraft I ever fought," he said carefully. The P-38 Lightning was more difficult to engage. The Hellcat was more numerous, but the Corsair was the most effective. Why? Because it was not designed to fight the Zero. It was designed to obsolete the Zero. There's a difference. He smiled sadly. "We built an aircraft to win dogfights. They built an aircraft to win wars. We focused on tactical excellence. They focused on strategic dominance." Who was right? Sakai gestured to the world around him. Prosperous, peaceful, dominated by American influence and technology. The answer is obvious, yes? The lesson echoes through military history. Superior technology matters, but superior tactics matter more. The Corsair wasn't just a faster airplane. It was a completely different approach to aerial combat, an approach that recognized the changing nature of warfare, from individual pilot skill to systemic advantages in speed, altitude, firepower, and energy. The Japanese pilots weren't cowards. They weren't poorly trained. They were trapped in a paradigm that had stopped working. And by the time they understood that, it was too late. Return to that airstrip at Rabaul, February 14th, 1943. Saburo Sakai climbs into his Zero, confident that American fighters can't match his aircraft's maneuverability. He's right, they can't. But 340 miles away, Kenneth Walsh is climbing into a Corsair that doesn't need to. The R-2800 roars to life. The propeller whistles. The bent-wing bird prepares for takeoff. And somewhere in the humid Pacific air, the rules of combat are about to change forever. Sakai will learn, eventually. Painfully, he'll learn irrelevant. And when you make your enemy's greatest strength irrelevant, you don't just win battles. You win wars. The Corsair's legacy isn't just victories or statistics or kill ratios. It's the proof that innovation beats tradition, that rethinking beats refining, that sometimes the best way to fight isn't to be better at the old game, it's to change the game entirely. The Japanese thought American fighters were slow, clumsy, and afraid. Then the Corsairs dove from the sun at 450 miles per hour, and the sky filled with whistling death. And nothing was ever the same.